I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Introduction. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 was one of the greatest military blunders of the 20th century. This supreme political and military folly led to Iraq standing alone and fighting a war against a coalition of forces that spanned the globe, a war that would have a profound impact on the affairs of the Middle East for decades and generations to come. Iraq had just completed a war with the Islamic Republic of Iran, a war in which Iraq was ironically being supported with weapons by the United States. This 8-year war achieved little and left Iraq with billions of dollars in debt and a largely wrecked economy. When the dust settled from the war with Iran, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein looked to his creditors for debt forgiveness. To Saddam's thinking, Iraq had fought the war to stop the Islamic Revolution in Iran from reaching their own doorsteps. This revolution saw the secular ruler of Iran deposed by fanatical Islamic zealots, a phenomenon that threatened to spread across the rest of the Middle East. From this perspective, the secular rulers of the other Arab nations in the region owed a degree of their security to Iraq, who had fought the war on their behalf. Because of this, Saddam felt his nation's debt should have been forgiven. The Gulf states who were owed money could argue that Saddam was motivated not by the best interests of his neighbors, but rather by greed. He sought to take advantage of a weakened Iran still recovering from the infighting of the revolution in order to seize the oil fields and port facilities in the oil-rich Iranian province of Khuzestan. In the end, although several of Saddam's key creditors, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain, agreed to forgive Iraq's war debt, the tiny nations of Kuwait and the UAE held firm. They wanted their money repaid. Their refusal to go along with the debt forgiveness that the other Arab nations had given Iraq led Saddam to develop plans of his own in dealing with Kuwait. In the lead-up to the war between Kuwait and Iraq, Saddam declared that Kuwait was illegally using slant wells to siphon off Iraqi oil. Saddam also cited the older argument that Kuwait was still a part of Iraq, as the Anglo-Ottoman Convention of 1913 had never been ratified, meaning the two countries had never officially been separated. But Saddam miscalculated the world's reaction to his attempt to seize and control the oil fields of Kuwait. Oil is the lifeblood of the world's economies. Any potential disruption of the flow of that oil could be disastrous for the United States specifically, and the West in general. This was demonstrated during the Iran-Iraq War, when fighting threatened shipping in the Persian Gulf. The United States Central Intelligence Agency reported that Gulf oil provided 40% of the oil in Western European markets and 60% in Japan. If that flow was interrupted, that volume would have to be recovered from other sources. Such a dramatic reduction in supply without a corresponding reduction in demand would inevitably lead to drastically higher prices. In threatening Middle Eastern oil exports, Saddam threatened the global economy. Saddam's advisors failed to impress upon him how the world would react should he try to seize Kuwait, a problem that was further compounded by the U.S. State Department. Prior to the invasion, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, informed the Iraqis that, "We have no opinion on the Arab-Arab conflicts, like your border disagreement with Kuwait." This was in spite of the fact that the U.S. intelligence community was already concerned that Iraq had intentions to seize Kuwait. 2 years before the actual invasion, the National Intelligence Officer for Economics, Dean E. Hoffman, concluded a report on the matter by stating, "In any case, we should remember that the Iraqis are very unpredictable and could move into Kuwait quite unexpectedly." While Saddam made some historically bad political miscalculations, he also overestimated the strength of his military forces. Although the Iraqi army was the fourth largest army in the world and battle-tested after an 8-year war with the Iranians, their military force was not a well-rounded one. Being a largely landlocked country, Iraq had no naval force to speak of. The port of Qasr was the closest thing to a port the Iraqis had, and access to the Persian Gulf could easily be controlled by Kuwait. In the air, the equipment in the Iraqi arsenal varied in quality and quantity. A typical surge day for the Air Force in the Iran-Iraq War was 40 sorties a day. At the conclusion of the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq had the largest air force in the region with over 1,000 aircraft. These were primarily Soviet and French designs. The French-designed Dassault Mirage F-1 strike fighters were equipped with Exocet anti-ship missiles. Iraq had shown the effectiveness of these missiles in 1987 when they were used to attack and disable the frigate USS Stark. In addition to this maritime strike capability, an extensive number of Su-22 and Su-24 aircraft were used in a close air support role. Equally impressive was the number of Soviet MiG fighters. These ranged from older MiG-21s to modern interceptors, like the MiG-25, and even the latest Soviet fighter, the MiG-29. All their pilots had combat training, and most had combat experience. On the ground, Iraq possessed a large number of tanks. While they were superior when fighting one of the country's neighbors, they were no match for the coalition forces despite their crew's recent combat experience, something the coalition forces did not have. While the Iraqi army had an armor and even a mechanized force that could be supported with artillery, what they truly lacked was the ability to combine all of that along with their air and helicopter force into an effective combined arms force. When considering Saddam's overestimation of the Iraqi military, there has been fierce debate over whether Iraq should have continued their invasion into and through Saudi Arabia. This could have given the Iraqis a much stronger negotiating position during any peace talks with the West. It is questionable at best whether the invasion could have succeeded to the extent that it could keep the United States and her allies from intervening. See the aforementioned state of the Iraqi military. But what would have happened if Saddam had been able to follow up on his invasion of Kuwait with an invasion of Saudi Arabia? What would have been necessary for that to happen? And how could it have changed the future of the Middle East and the world? How would things have turned out if their ally, the Soviet Union, had opted in its final years to exact its revenge on the West by providing covert support to the Iraqis? This series will explore how things might have turned out had Saddam's army been better prepared to fight at the outset of the war, and had he not stopped in Kuwait but kept on going. We hope you enjoy this short break from reality and join us in the world of what if things had played out differently. Chapter 1. Highway of Death, 8th August 1990. 495th Tactical Fighter Squadron, Aviano, Italy. Major William Gunslinger. Kidd looked at the briefing material and shook his head. This was going to be a tough mission. The Saudi Air Force, along with several American F-14 Tomcats, had already lost a handful of aircraft attacking the Republican Guard Division. No matter what anyone thought, this mission wouldn't be a walk in the park. Major Kidd, the briefer from the operations center said, breaking into his thoughts. Your flight will be responsible for hitting the bridge near Al Petra. It's right before the village of Tadij here. He pointed to a spot on the map. It crosses a large wadi that the 7th Division needs to cross. It's imperative your flight take out the bridge and then go after as many of the armor formation as you can. Gunslinger replied, If our primary objective is the bridge, then I'd like 2 of our planes equipped with a Paveway GBU-10. A 500-pounder may not be enough to take it out depending on how well it was constructed. The briefer nodded and wrote something down on his notepad. Agreed. I'll make the change. Do you want one on your aircraft? Gunslinger looked at his fellow pilots and could tell from their eager expressions that each of them wanted to be the pilot to carry one of the paveways. "Nah, put one on Joker's aircraft and one on Ryson's. We'll let the kids have fun with this one." His joke elicited a few laughs from the other pilots and some nods of appreciation. It wasn't every day you got to drop a laser-guided bomb on a bridge. These were state-of-the-art bombs just now being introduced into the inventory. "What kind of AA support will this Iraqi division have that we should be aware of?" asked Gunslinger. He already knew the answer. He just wanted his junior officers to hear it a second time. While he'd flown in Operation El Dorado Canyon, the air raid against Muammar Gaddafi's government in Libya, these young pups hadn't. A captain from the 1N, or intelligence shop, stood up and made his way to the briefing lectern. "My name is Captain Wolf. Based on both aerial surveillance and post-mission briefings from the other squadrons, the Iraqi army has been equipped with a wide variety of air defense weapons, which now appear to have been provided nearly a year ago by the Soviet Union, following a massive foreign military sale agreement." "Whoa, did you just say the Soviet Union provided them with a slew of mobile SAM and AA trucks?" repeated Gunslinger, adding important details that he wanted his men to know. Captain Wolf took a breath in before he sighed. "That's how it appears. We're hoping to have better intelligence on this in the near future. Regardless, the 7th Adnan Division has a mixture of ZSU-23-4 Shilkas, which are 23mm quad-gun mounted tracked vehicles. These weapons have seen wide use in the Arab-Israeli wars, so we're pretty familiar with how they work. The number one thing I can tell you about them is, don't get too close." This division successfully shot down 2 F-15s and more than a handful of Saudi aircraft already. The division is also traveling with some mobile SAM launchers. Your flight is going to have to be extremely careful in how you attack them. You'll have a flight of wild weasels flying in ahead of you to take out any of the radars that try to track you, and you'll have some sparkvarks out there to jam the enemy radars that survive the weasels. We don't anticipate significant enemy fighter activity, but we'll have some F-15Cs providing fighter cover to keep you from getting bounced if some do show up." Captain Wolf paused for a moment before adding, "Don't take these systems lightly, okay? We made some tactical errors at the start of the war. We falsely assumed our electronic systems could defeat them. That was a mistake on our part. Consequently, we've lost more than 24 aircraft since the start of this campaign. Our CAD-1 missions are starting to work, but they take time. So keep your heads on a swivel and stay frosty out there." "With that, I'll hand the rest of the mission over to you, Major Kidd," Captain Wolf said, before returning to his seat. Walking up to the lectern, Gunslinger announced, "Listen up, pups." He liked to refer to the pilots in his flight as pups, mostly because they were all junior captains, fresh from training, and had little experience. "The wild weasels are going to attract those AA guns and SAMs for us. They'll do their best to take them out prior to our arrival, but that doesn't mean a few won't play possum on us. Likewise, the Sparkvarks are going to do their best to jam the hell out of their radars and communication systems. Again, that's only going to slow them down, not stop them. When we go in, expect the enemy to be ready and gunning for us. This is going to be a hot and heavy fight we're flying into," he explained. He then brought up the map of the target area. "Joker, you're going to hang back at a higher altitude and go for the bridge with your laser-guided bomb. Ryson, you're the alternate in case Joker gets shot down or misses. If he scores a hit and the bridge is taken out, then use the paveway on whatever target you choose. Just make sure it's worthy of 2,000 pounds of pain." The two pilots nodded. "Chicken and I are going to swoop in fast, roughly 500 feet above the deck from the east, so the opposite direction from the rest of our support aircraft." Gunslinger then looked specifically at Chicken, who'd be flying as his wingman for this mission. "Chicken, once we go in, we need to time the release of our first 2 sticks of MK-82s. Remember, we're carrying 6 sticks of 6 500-pound bombs. We're likely going to make 3 attack runs across the division, so we'll evaluate where we want to place our sticks across the areas where we'll cause the most damage." Gunslinger surveyed his 3 pilots. Just remember, our mission is to cause as much damage and destruction to this armored column as we can. 50 or so kilometers to the southwest is the Saudi 45th Armored Brigade. They've been fighting a tactical retreat against this division since the start of the war. We need to buy these guys as much time as we can. Joker asked, Gunslinger, once we've taken the bridge out, do you want us to just pick our own targets to go after? Gunslinger thought about that for a moment. He knew it'd be better if they could link up and hit the enemy together. Then again, it was going to be pretty chaotic once they started their attack runs. Let's do this. Once Chicken and I finish our first attack run and you guys nail that bridge, we'll see where everyone is and what the situation on the ground looks like. If it's too hot, we may need to just make this a high-altitude bombing run. Ideally, we want to get as low as we can to place our ordnance on target. High-altitude bombing just isn't as accurate unless we have the entire squadron or even wing participate in it. Sounds good to us, Haas, said one of the pilots carrying the new laser-guided bombs. They were excited and ginned up. This was their first combat mission. They were the first guys from their squadron and wing to get to use the new laser-guided bombs. After 90 minutes of flight time, their flight of 4 F-111 aardvarks was nearing the target zone. The surrounding air was abuzz with activity. Listening to the comms, Gunslinger heard the air battle managers in the Joint Surveillance and Target Attack Radar System, or JSTARS aircraft. They were 100 miles away, directing the Weasels towards the location of the enemy SAMs and AA trucks. The high-powered airborne ground surveillance equipment was critical in helping the aircraft identify the locations of the Iraqi ground formations. Using some deductive reasoning, and based on the formations, the battle managers on the aircraft would vector in the aircraft to a specific target's most likely locations. Not too far from the E-8 JSTARS aircraft was the E-3 Sentry AWACS, or Airborne Early Warning and Control System plane. They were responsible for watching the skies around the area to make sure no enemy fighters vectored into the area. If the Iraqis sent some MiGs in their direction, then they'd direct the F-15Cs to go in and deal with them. Karma 4-1, Eagle 6. We show clear skies. Handing you off to Hawk 2. Good luck. Over. Karma 4-1, good copy. Eagle 6, out. Moments later, Gunslinger's radio squawked again. Karma 4-1, Hawk 2. Wild Weasels are finishing up their attack run of known SAM sites now. Karma 4-3 is cleared to engage the bridge. Once the bridge is destroyed, we want Karma 4-1 and 4-2 vectored to Sector 6. You're cleared to engage them as you see fit. Karma 4-3 and 4-4 will engage Sector 2 as they see fit. Once you've expended your ordnance, you are cleared to RTB. How copy? Asked the battle manager. Depressing the talk button, Gunslinger replied, Hawk 2, Karma 4-1, that's a good copy. He then switched to his flight's channel. Karma 4-3 and 4-4, you are cleared to engage the bridge. Get it done ASAP. Then you're to move to Sector 2 and make your attack runs. Don't dawdle. Get your runs in and hit 'em hard and fast. We'll link back up at Rally Point Zulu and head home together. Out. Gunslinger then looked at the map of the sectors his flight was being told to engage. He saw exactly what the battle manager was looking to do. It was a wide-open desert area along the 2 major highways heading towards Jeddah and Medina. They were going to plaster the motorized division in the open areas. If they played their cards right, this could turn into a turkey shoot. Collectively, his single flight of 4 aircraft was going to drop 100-2,500-pound bombs across these guys. That was a lot of bombs for a single mission. With that in mind, he flipped back to Channel 3. Hawk 2, Karma 4-1. I've directed my guys to engage the bridge with their paveways. Both myself and 4-2 are carrying 6 sticks of 500-pounders. Our intent is to make 3 runs, releasing 2 sticks on each run. How copy? There was a moment of silence. Presumably the battle managers were conferring with each other. Karma 4-2, that's a negative. We have hostile aircraft inbound, so new orders. We need you to position yourself for a long single run, deploying your sticks along the way. Same with Karma 4-3 and 4-4 once the bridge is out. Eagle 6 is showing some hostile aircraft being scrambled out of Riyadh. We want to get you guys in and out before they get in range of you. How copy? Damn, hostile aircraft already. Thank God we've got some F-15s out here with us. We aren't exactly equipped to take on enemy aircraft. That's a good copy. Thanks for the heads up. We're going to angle in for our attacks now. Out. Switching back to his flight's channel, Gunslinger said, "Heads up, pups. We got inbound hostile aircraft heading towards us. Our Eagle pilots are moving to engage them as we speak. This means we need to drop our loads and get out of Dodge. 4-3 and 4-4, I want you both to hit that bridge with your Pavway. We don't have time to make sure the first one hits and goes off. Once you've got confirmation it's down, you need to hit your sector. Because we're short on time, you need to make a single bomb run. We can't stick around to hit them twice. You guys got this. You've trained for this in the past. Now it's time to put that training to work. How copy?" "That's a good copy, Gunslinger. We'll get that bridge taken down." Gunslinger smiled at the confidence of his pilots. He'd been training them hard since they'd arrived in his unit. It was good to see that level of training starting to kick in. "Chicken, it's just you and me. Let's get positioned to make our run. I want us to line up along the southwestern side of Sector 6 at an altitude of 2,000 feet at 450 miles per hour. When it comes to releasing our sticks, we're going to release them one at a time. You need to pay attention to when each stick has been released. Then, and only then, do you start the process of releasing the next one. By slowing ourselves down to 450 miles per hour, we should be able to release our entire loads across 3/4 of the sector. Once we're dry on bombs, we're going to bank to our right as we look to gain altitude and put some distance between us and them. You got all this, Chicken?" Chicken took a second before replying. "Got it, Gunslinger. I'll follow your lead." "Good. He sounds confident and ready for action," Gunslinger thought. In the distance, he saw 2 bright flashes of light on the ground. He knew the bridge had likely been taken out. His other 2 pilots would be circling back around to get in position for their own attack runs. Within a minute after the bridge went up in smoke, his co-pilot and bombardier pointed to a new set of warning lights that had just turned on. They were less than 20 kilometers from starting their bombing run when their radar homing and warning system, or HAW, came to life. At least one SAM, or radar-guided AA truck, had turned on its search radar. They likely knew something was about to happen, given that the bridge they needed to secure had just blown up. "Looks like things are about to get interesting," said Captain Bud Jugs Barrel. He was an avid beer drinker noted for drinking large quantities and not being affected. He would be the electronic warfare officer on this mission. "Just stay on the jamming and get those sticks ready to go. We're only going to get one pass at this," Gunslinger replied. Jugs nodded and started the process of getting their bombs ready to drop. At their current speeds, they'd start delivering the pain in less than 3 minutes. Gunslinger glanced to his left and saw Chicken. He was slightly behind him and about 100 meters back. Although they didn't have any lights on their planes, he could still make out the soft glow of Chicken's cockpit lights against the darkness. Returning his gaze to the front, he could see the new day was starting to creep ever closer. It would be dawn in another 5 minutes. All the more reason to get this run completed before the sun made it easier to spot them. "1 minute out," Jugs called out, just in time for them both to see the remnants of the night sky in front of them erupt in a spectacular display of red and green tracer fire. "Whoa, that's a lot of ground fire," Jugs exclaimed as they continued to fly towards it. "No joke. This is going to get crazy. I'm going to bring us up to 3,000 feet and increase our speed to 550. He then sent a quick message to Chicken, letting him know of the change. 30 seconds, said Jugs. The volume of ground fire only seemed to increase as they got closer. "Hang on, we're almost over the target," Gunslinger announced excitedly. "3rd Squadron, Iraqi Air Force." Major Vitaly Popkov kept his MiG-29 low to the ground, flying just 50 feet above the desert. The plane was flying at 1,200 miles per hour, living up to its unofficial nickname of Stridge, Russian for swift. While the others in his squadron were mixing it up with the American F-15s, he opted to see if he could nail the large, lumbering American AWACS plane and that other radar-emitting aircraft. If he could catch 1 or 2 of these bombers along the way, he'd count that as a bonus. Flying past the 7th Motorized Division, Popkov saw the sky around the division lighting up with ground fire. He knew the American bombers must be making their attack runs. If he was lucky, he might catch 1 or more of them on their way out of the area. Soon, the ground began to ripple with a long line of explosions tearing through the division. A division his squadron of pilots was supposed to be providing cover for to prevent a situation like this from happening. Once they'd received the alert of American aircraft heading towards the division, their squadron had been ordered to get airborne and see what they could do to protect them. Unfortunately, the Iraqi ground crews were not nearly as good as their Soviet counterparts at getting an aircraft spun up for a quick mission. By the time they were in the air, the first wave of American aircraft had already hit the division. They knew a second wave of low-level bombers was inbound, and a handful of American F-15s were loitering high above to provide air cover. They should have been airborne 30 minutes ago. Had they had a Soviet ground crew, they would have been. Popkov was still fuming at the ineptitude of the ground crew servicing their aircraft and how long it had taken them to get airborne. "I hate having to work with these Iraqis," he lamented. Seeing more explosions continuing to ripple through the vehicles to his left, Popkov had an idea. He was still flying roughly 50 meters above the ground when he reached for his radar control button and flicked it on. In seconds, his screen showed him a flight of 2 aircraft less than 15 kilometers from his position. 30 kilometers away, he saw another 2. Given their speed and heading, Popkov judged these to be additional strike fighters. Another 90 kilometers away, he could see his primary targets, the US AWACS planes. Knowing he had to act quickly, Popkov flicked on the seeker head of his R-73 missiles and waited until he had a solid lock on the 2 strike planes. They were splitting up now that they knew they were in trouble. "Squirm all you want, you can't escape the Mayak," he thought as he pickled off the first heat-seeking missile. He then turned towards the other attacker trying to flee the scene of the crime and locked it up with his second R-73. The target had gone to full afterburner, doing its best to outrun the fighter now on its tail. Popkov was not to be deterred. He accelerated his own aircraft to keep the target in range. His missile was just at the outer edge of its range, and he wanted to make sure he scored a hit. Before the bomber could get outside his range, Popkov turned the seeker head on to let the missile acquire the target. It took only moments for the missile to lock onto the afterburners of the aircraft. Popkov smiled a wicked smile as he depressed the pickle button one more time. The missile leapt from its underwing pylon and shot off after the bomber. In seconds, the solid-fuel rocket engine reached its maximum speed of Mach 2.5, eating away at the distance to the fleeing raider. Popkov watched as the target spat out flares and attempted to turn away from the missile. Watching the bomber's futile attempts to evade the missile, he assumed the pilot must be new and inexperienced. No veteran pilot would release flares while leaving his afterburner on. He'd turn the greatest heat source off first, then release the flares and bank away, leading the missile to believe the flares were the tailpipe of the aircraft. Instead, this pilot had not only kept his afterburner on, he'd compounded his mistake by turning away from the flares, allowing the seeker head to know which was the plane and which was not. 3 seconds later, Popkov was rewarded with a flash of light near the rear of the bomber. Moments later, he saw a streak of flame come from the side of it. Then the pilots ejected, only to see their aircraft explode into a fireball moments later. Smiling, Popkov angled towards the two prize targets he was really after. At this point, there was no reason to leave his search radar off. The Americans knew he was here, and so did the F-15s. Glancing at his radar, he saw that the American fighters were still in a fight against the other members of his squadron. They were nearly 140 kilometers away, too far to intercede and deny him his aerial victory. Turning his aircraft towards the American AWACS, he accelerated to get in range of his R-27 missiles. Compared to the R-73s, this missile, which NATO called Alamo, had a greater range and a larger warhead, and it traveled at speeds up to Mach 4.5. It was not an easy missile to outrun or evade. He glanced at his airspeed. He was still traveling close to 1,200 kilometers per hour. "Slow down. You're wasting fuel," he chided himself. He wasn't too far from the big, lumbering radar plane. In under a minute, he'd be able to fire off one of his R-27 missiles. It took less than a second for his aircraft's warning systems to alert him that one of the American fighters was attempting to lock onto him. The aircraft must have broken off its engagement to come after me. He recalled an old adage his father used to tell him: "You're swinging your fists after the fight is over." He chuckled to himself as he activated one of his two R-27 missiles. Then his SPO-15 Berioza Radar Warning Receiver, or RWR, mounted on the top of his two rear horizontal stabilizers, blared its own warning. The American fighter had just fired a missile at him. Looking at the distance between him and the fighter, he knew the missile was likely an AIM-7 Sparrow, since he was facing off against an F-15 and not a Navy F-14, which likely would have fired an AIM-54 Phoenix at much greater range. "I've got just enough time to get my missile off before I have to worry about that Sparrow and deal with that fighter." Turning on the first R-27, Popkov got a solid lock on the American AWACS plane. Once he had the lock, he didn't wait around. He fired the missile and watched as it began its high-speed pursuit of what was essentially a Boeing 707 airliner. With his missile away, he turned to deal with the incoming threat. The little bastard was less than 10 kilometers away from him, and closing fast. Popkov dove for the ground. He angled his aircraft into a zero-G dive, allowing gravity to help him build up his airspeed. The Sparrow was now less than 5 kilometers from him. Reaching for his chaff dispenser, he fired off one set. This ejected a small cloud of aluminum foil strips meant to obscure the Sparrow's radar homing seeker, tricking it into believing the fast-approaching wall of foil was in fact the target it was after. As the chaff dispersed behind him, Popkov pulled back on the stick and angled his aircraft to the right before hitting his own afterburner. The force of the G's being thrown at him pinned him to the seat and almost caused him to black out as his vision tunneled. When his sight returned, an explosion occurred not too far from his aircraft. Checking his systems, he saw he hadn't sustained any damage, at least none that was throwing up a warning light. He'd successfully evaded the missile. Turning his aircraft towards the American plane that was still barreling towards him, he activated the seeker head on his R-73 missile and allowed it to get a lock. He released the missile to begin its pursuit of the American F-15. When the aircraft broke away to evade the missile barreling down on it, Popkov activated his remaining R-27. Once it had also locked onto the American, he let loose with that missile as well. The American now had to contend with both a heat seeker and an active radar homing missile, two missiles that engaged a target in slightly different ways. In the distance towards Taif, a flash of light lit up the remaining darkness. Popkov smiled as his R-27 connected with the American Boeing 707. The fiery wreck of the plane fell to the ground below as the aircraft broke apart. Then he looked for the other 707. The little bastard was going all out back to Medina. If he didn't take care of this fighter on his tail now, he'd likely never catch up to the Boeing plane. He refocused his attention on the F-15. The American was doing his best to evade the R-27 as he unloaded chaff behind him. Unlike the American bomber pilot, this guy appeared to know what he was doing. Even so, he was so busy paying attention to the missiles, he didn't realize the MiG was closing in to get within gun range. The R-27 bit on the chaff and exploded. The F-15 banked hard to the left as it climbed to gain some altitude and speed. The R-73 was hot on its tail. The missile continued to close the gap between them. The American deployed flares, trying to break the lock. "I'm almost there," Popkov said to himself. The R-73 detonated just behind the F-15. The shrapnel burst from the missile tore into the left side of the giant American fighter plane. The pilot tried to stabilize his aircraft. It looked like he'd already used his fire extinguisher on the left engine. He was now flying with just one engine, while the other trailed smoke. Flicking the safety off his guns, Popkov watched as his targeting reticle lined up. He depressed the button, letting a string of 20 30mm rounds rip into the body of his prey. New flashes of flame erupted in the middle of the aircraft. Popkov turned away, knowing it was likely to explode. Fractions of a second later, that was exactly what it did. The plane exploded into hundreds of pieces as it began its journey to the ground. The sun was finally starting to rise, making it easy for him to see. He didn't spot any parachutes. The pilot likely hadn't had enough time to eject. That kind of saddened Popkov. Just because they had fought an aerial battle didn't mean he wanted to kill the pilot, just his aircraft. He supposed that was some long-lost trait he shared with the aerial knights of the past. Checking his fuel gauge and then the distance to the remaining Boeing 707, he saw he had enough fuel to get there and take it out. He also saw a new set of American fighters heading towards the battle space from Medina. While he had fuel, he was alone and down to a single remaining R-73. He might have fancied himself one of the best Russian fighter pilots, but he wasn't stupid enough to believe he could take on 6 F-15s on his own. "It looks like you live to fight another day," he said softly to himself. He then turned his aircraft away from the American fighters and headed back to base. 4 kills is good enough for one day. Chapter 2. Perestroika. 18 months prior. April 1989. Kremlin. Moscow, Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev looked at Vladimir Khrushchev, the head of the KGB, asking, "So it's true? President Bush is continuing his predecessor's pressure campaign against the Arabs to further drive down the price of oil?" Khrushchev nodded. "Unfortunately, yes, Mr. President. At every corner, the Americans are attempting to counter our efforts to reform our economy and country." "To what end, Khrushchev?" asked Ivan Silayev, the chairman of the Committee on the Operational Management of the Soviet Economy. "The Americans keep talking about peace and a normalization of relations between our two nations. Why would they then thwart our efforts at reform?" As the man charged with implementing Gorbachev's perestroika policy efforts, Silayev was particularly annoyed with the policy. "Why do you think, Silayev? The West has been at war with our people and way of life since the end of the Great Patriotic War. Look what they did to our forces in Afghanistan. The Americans have no love for the Afghan people or the Islamic fundamentalists, but they recruited them by the thousands from the Middle East to travel to Afghanistan to butcher our communist brothers there. President Reagan found our soft underbelly: oil. Now the Americans are going to use that to destroy us from within," chided Khrushchev angrily. No one in the briefing room said anything right away. They were all waiting to see what Gorbachev would say next. Finally, Valentin Pavlov, the Minister of Finance, dared to speak. "Mr. President, I think Kryuchkov is right about the Americans finding a spot within our economy where they can attack us. Your economic program is revolutionary. If it had been implemented 10 years ago, when you first raised the issues of our central planning and agricultural production, we wouldn't be in such dire straits today. Be that as it may, we are here. We need time for perestroika to work, and the Americans do not want us to have that time. I believe there is a way that we can get that time. Perhaps we can counter what they are doing in the Middle East. I fear if something is not done soon to address this problem, Mr. President, then it will only be a matter of time until our economy and country collapse." General Valentin Varenikov, the head of the Russian army, caught the eye of Kryuchkov, who nodded for him to say something. Clearing his throat to gain everyone's attention, General Varenikov offered, "There may be a solution to our problem standing before us, a way to solve the oversupply problem in the Middle East, and once again tilt the balance away from the Americans and back to the middle." Gorbachev lifted an eyebrow at the subtle comment from the head of the army. He motioned with a twist of his wrist for him to continue. "Mr. President, Kryuchkov and I, along with some of the other military chiefs, have been talking privately about an idea to handle this problem I believe you will find agreeable," Varenikov explained. Interrupting him before he could go further, Gorbachev countered, "It had better not be a direct confrontation with the Americans or the West. While I believe you have done a fine job working to rebuild the army after the Afghan withdrawal, we are hardly in a position to wage a war." With his cheeks blushing slightly, Varenikov countered, "Of course not, Mr. President. The other chiefs and I also agree with that assessment. Please, if you will allow me a moment to explain. We have two prominent allies in the Middle East, Syria and Iraq. Iraq just concluded an 8-year war with Iran. During this war, Iran succeeded in causing instability in the region by attacking oil platforms and tankers as they transited through the Strait of Hormuz and in the Gulf itself. This eventually resulted in the American Navy launching its largest naval action since World War II, when they pursued and destroyed most of the Iranian Navy. That brought stability back to the oil markets, and it gave us an idea. At the end of the war between Iran and Iraq, Iraq was left with billions of dollars in debt. President Hussein asked his Arab debtors if they would forgive his debt, since it was his military that fought against Iran's Islamic Revolution and kept it from spreading to their nations. Many of these nations agreed to forgive their debt, except for Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates. To further complicate this problem between Iraq and some of their oil-rich neighbors, Iraq claims to have evidence that Kuwaiti oil companies have been leveraging slant wells to siphon Iraq's own oil. Pavlov cut him off. "What is your point, General?" Tilting his head, Varenikov gave the finance minister an angry look. "My point, Minister, is we can use this dispute between Iraq, Kuwait, and their neighbors as a means to both create instability within the Middle East and drive up the price of oil. It's a legitimate border dispute between the two nations, and one that could be stoked into an actual conflict." Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze leaned forward in his chair as he entered the conversation for the first time. "Mr. President, this operation with Iraq is a solid, viable option to consider. The simmering issues between Kuwait and Iraq have gone on for generations. It would not take much to push this issue in the direction we want and engineer the kind of economic results we are looking for." Dmitry Yazov, the Minister of Defense, added, "We could provide the Iraqis with improved weapons and military equipment to help ensure a quick victory. We could also provide the Iranians with anti-ship weapons and naval mines to cause problems in the strait to further aggravate the situation for the Americans." Gorbachev then asked, "What if the Iraqis decide they want to expand beyond Kuwait? Say they decide they want to grab the rest of Saudi Arabia. Then what?" Shevardnadze shrugged his shoulders as he responded, then our oil problem goes away indefinitely. If the West tries to come to the aid of the Saudis, then that war would take them years to conclude. In either case, we will see the price of oil continue to rise as both the production of it in the Middle East is halted, and the Iranians make it nearly impossible for tankers to travel freely through the strait. No one spoke for a few minutes as Gorbachev sat back in his chair. As he did during moments that required a big decision, he turned his chair to look out the Kremlin window at Red Square. If we don't try something, our country is doomed. Turning back to look at his advisors, Gorbachev announced, "Let's stir the pot. Tell the president of Iraq I would like to meet with him. Let's begin looking at what we can provide them and the Iranians in terms of military aid." Lubyanka Building, Moscow, Russia. If we are going to go this route, providing the Iraqis with the necessary military equipment to create the kind of instability and chaos you are hoping for, comrade, it is going to require substantial quantities of A-level, or at least B-level, equipment, General Valentin Varenikov said, as he pulled another Ziganov cigarette out and lit it. Blowing smoke out through his nose, Khrushchev agreed, "Da, it will. But if we can make it work, Valentin, it could be the thing to save the Soviet Union. Things around us are starting to fall apart, comrade. If decisive action is not taken soon, not only will the economy implode, it will mean the downfall of the entire system. Things in the GDR are already starting to come unraveled. Are you sure it is not already too late to prevent the collapse of Warsaw Pact, Vladimir? If appropriate actions are taken sooner rather than later, then yes, comrade, I believe our collapse can be stopped. But it will require a concerted effort on our part. What forces would you recommend transferring to the Iraqis?" the KGB director asked. Pulling some folders out of his briefcase, the general thumbed through them until he found the one he was looking for. "My staff has done a complex review of the Iraqi army, post-Iran war. Their soldiers are battle-hardened from years of war, but their equipment has been greatly depleted. Most of what they operate is extremely old Russian and Chinese surplus equipment. It may have been effective against a poorly trained and led Iranian force, but it will have a hard time holding up against the better-equipped Kuwaiti or even Saudi armies, to say nothing of the Americans, should they opt to get involved at a later time," the general explained, his cigarette moving with his lips as he spoke. "Are you saying this plan is outside our reach or ability to make work?" the spymaster inquired, a bit of concern showing on his face. General Varenikov shook his head as he took another drag on his cigarette, holding the nicotine in long enough for it to be absorbed in his lungs before blowing it out. "No, it can be done. As a matter of fact, it may solve some of our financial problems in the process. Transferring some of our better-equipped units will eliminate the maintenance costs of them from our books. Once the Iraqis control the Kuwaiti oil fields, they'll be able to cut oil production to drive up the price and pay off the loans for the equipment." Chuckling at the comment, Khrushchev commented, "Look at you, comrade. You sound like a capitalist striking a deal to steal the labor of the proletariat." The two of them laughed at the irony before they turned serious again. "How soon can you begin transferring equipment and getting their people up to speed on it?" asked the spymaster as his eyes narrowed. Sensing the change in mood, the old general replied, "As soon as the Iraqis agree to the plan. How soon do you think that'll be?" Khrushchev looked at the calendar on the wall, searching for some dates on it. "Soon. It has to be soon. We need to get this show moving before we run out of time." Chapter 3. Genie in a Bottle. Late April 1989. Soviet Embassy, Baghdad, Iraq. The entourage from Moscow, led by Foreign Minister Shevardnadze and Major General Sokolov, greeted the ambassador to Iraq, Viktor Minin, who had been at the post now for nearly 7 years. Standing there with the ambassador was his military advisor, Colonel Popov, and the KGB station chief, Colonel Chekhov. "Hello, Minister Shevardnadze, General Sokolov. I trust your flight in from Moscow was uneventful." the ambassador asked, as he guided his boss and his entourage to a sitting room nearby. "Da, it was pleasant enough, comrade. Is our meeting this evening with Saddam ready? We have much to discuss," Minister Shevardnadze replied, all business as was his personality. The ambassador nodded. "It is. They are expecting you. There will be some photos taken when everyone arrives, just like normal. Then there will be a small dinner with just you, General Sokolov, myself, and Colonel Popov. On their side, Saddam, Vice President Izzat al-Duri, General Ra'ad al-Hamdani, head of the Republican Guard, and Tariq Aziz, the Deputy Prime Minister." "Excellent, comrade. Thank you for arranging this meeting on such short notice. There are some big changes coming to Iraq. Please, let's have some tea and discuss them briefly, Victor," Shevardnadze said pleasantly. He knew Minin was tired of the Middle East and wanted to return to Moscow or a more pleasant posting somewhere else. The man had served well in Iraq. Now he'd need to serve a bit longer. The two of them moved to his private study to talk alone and took a seat as their tea was brought in. "Victor, I am not going to be able to transfer you to another posting just yet. There are some big things about to happen in Iraq and the Middle East. You are our most knowledgeable ambassador and trusted diplomat in the region. I am going to need you here for what is about to come next." Ambassador Minin sighed at the news. He knew there wasn't much he could say or do about it, so he tried to make the best of it. "My wife and I had looked forward to returning to Moscow, but perhaps you have a better assignment for us once whatever happens here is complete." Smiling at the man's attempt to negotiate, Shevardnadze pulled his cigarette case out and extracted one of his favorite cigarettes, a Marlboro. He loved the taste of the American tobacco. Sitting back in the chair as he crossed his left leg over his right, he looked at Minin. "Come to think of it, comrade, I think there is a posting that will be opening up in either Paris, London, or New York, once you let me know where you'd like to go after this operation has concluded." Minin's eyes lit up at the thought of gaining such a prestigious posting after such a long career in the slums of the Middle East. "Comrade, what is it Moscow has cooked up for the Iraqis that I can assist you with?" With their internal negotiations complete, it was now time to discuss the reason for the trip. "As you know, comrade, the president has been pushing through a series of economic and political reforms back home. Some have been well received, some have not. While the president is facing a lot of internal pressure from the hardliners, we are also facing enormous economic pressures from the Americans. Recent intelligence has uncovered a plot by the Americans who are pressuring the House of Saud, along with the other Gulf states, to artificially depress the price of oil to drive our own prices down. The Americans are also pushing the Arabs to cut special deals with countries who currently purchase Soviet oil to get them to purchase theirs instead. This secret oil policy the Americans are pursuing is undercutting the exports of our own domestic oil, a natural resource our nation depends on to provide for our people," Shevardnadze explained. Minin took the information in, though he didn't appear the least bit surprised by any of it. He replied, "The Iraqis believe something like this has been going on behind their backs as well. While some of the Arab countries have agreed to forgive Iraq's war debt for fighting the Islamic Revolution, others are using that debt to keep Iraq poor and in a hard place. As if the Kuwaitis do not have enough of their own oil, during the summer, the Iraqis learned they have been using a new type of oil drilling technology called slant well drilling to steal Iraq's oil, while at the same time increasing daily production to further drive down the price." Nodding at the confirmation of what he already knew, Shevardnadze then asked, "So the Iraqis are going to be pretty open to any idea we offer them about disrupting the supply of oil and raising the price?" Almost laughing at the question, Minin countered, "Comrade, they will likely ask how soon you would like them to start. But mind you, whatever you ask them to do, We are going to need to help them economically to make it happen. I think we have a plan that will be to their liking. What about the hardliners back in Moscow? Are they going to go along with whatever Gorbachev is proposing to do with the Iraqis? The foreign minister smiled as he nodded. At first, they did not. But when they realized how badly this would impact the Americans, and how this might be the surest way to ensure the survival of the Soviet Union, they agreed to fully support it. Comrade, if I may, what is going on in Germany and Poland? I have a brother stationed in Germany, and he is telling me he thinks the GDR is going to collapse in the coming months. Is Moscow going to allow that to happen? Sighing, Shevardnadze answered, I honestly do not know. It is a tricky situation that is going on. The hardliners, of course, want Moscow to intervene if it comes to that, but I am not sure what Gorbachev will do. Come, let us not worry about what is outside of our control. We have a dinner party to prepare for, comrade. As the presidential guards held the door to the vehicle open, Foreign Minister Shevardnadze and his entourage exited and made their way inside the presidential palace. This was one thing Shevardnadze liked about the Middle East. Each of these leaders, no matter how big or wealthy their country was, made a point of having these massive and over-the-top opulent presidential palaces. Upon entering the formal greeting room, the Russian delegation was greeted by their Iraqi counterparts. The Russians moved towards the Iraqi leaders and began the process of greeting them and exchanging some pleasantries. A couple of photographers and a camera crew made sure to document the event. Pictures were taken of the Soviet foreign minister shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, Tariq Aziz, and Izzat al-Duri. Once the required propaganda pieces had been handled, the group made their way to a sitting room, where they spent the next 20 minutes discussing nothing of real importance. When their private dinner was ready, the 4 Russians and 4 Iraqis were ushered into an exquisite dining room for a private dinner. Over the next hour, the group continued to make small talk, sharing some stories and information about their families and children before their conversation turned to politics and what was going on in the Middle East. As they finished dinner, some desserts and coffees were brought out as they moved to another room with 4 couches and a table sitting in the center. The drinks and desserts were placed on the center table, and then the attendants left the room, closing the doors behind them. Minister Shevardnadze then got down to the business of why he had traveled to Iraq. Mr. President, President Gorbachev and the people of the Soviet Union have learned something that we felt important enough that it should be shared with you immediately. This is why I was dispatched to bring it to you personally and to share with you a proposal on how best to counter it. The Iraqi leaders shared a look, but said nothing as they waited for their guest to elaborate further. We understand that your country has fallen on some hard economic times since the end of your war with Iran. We also believe we understand who is to blame for these hard times that have befallen you, and that this was no coincidence either. Rather, this is a well-laid-out plan by the Americans. Now the Iraqis appeared interested. Al-Duri was the first to speak. We know who is responsible for our economic troubles. It is our renegade province, Kuwait. Not only will they not forgive our war debt, for a war we fought on their behalf, our oil engineers have determined they are using illegal slant wells to siphon our own oil away from us. The Iraqi field marshal was seething with anger as he spoke. The president sitting on the couch next to him looked equally angry, but held his tongue for the moment. Shevardnadze nodded in solidarity. Yes, we have heard that as well, but our intelligence sources have also uncovered a much more elaborate plan at play, one that unfortunately uses Iraq as a disposable pawn of the West. Saddam Hussein lifted an eyebrow at this acknowledgement, asking, "What do you mean, a plot by the West to use Iraq as a pawn?" Think about it, Mr. President. The Americans used Iraq as a proxy to fight the Islamic Republic after their own humiliating military defeat when attempting to free their hostages 9 years ago. Instead of fighting Iran directly, they pushed you into a war they knew you were not prepared to win. They provided your military with just enough aid to make you think you could win, but ultimately, it just kept you fighting for years longer than you should have. Then, when the war ended, instead of encouraging Kuwait and the UAE to forgive your debt, they convinced these nations to increase the production of oil, which only drove the price down to such levels that you could never repay your debt. It was a ruse and a trap meant to hurt and weaken Iraq and prevent your nation from becoming the leader of the Arab world, the foreign minister explained as he began to spin his elaborate story. Snorting at the yarn being spun, Izzat al-Duri countered, "We know of your own troubles with the price of oil. Now that the Americans are done using Iraq, they are sacrificing our nation along with the rest of the Arab world in their attempt to destroy the evil Soviet Empire." Al-Duri's words dripped with contempt and venom. It was clear he had no love for the Americans or how they had used his nation in the Iraq-Iran war, especially now that America was working with Iraq's own Arab brothers to undercut them economically. Smiling at being partially discovered, Minister Shevardnadze elaborated, "This is how the West works. They use their economy to destabilize a nation or region. Then, when civil unrest or war erupts, they swoop in as saviors to bring peace and their brand of freedom and democracy, capitalism to exploit the beaten-down workers who are left as beggars in their own country. This is the way of the West. OPEC was supposed to be different. OPEC was supposed to bring stability to the world oil market, and more importantly, it was supposed to bring wealth to the Arab world and prevent it from being taken advantage of." Saddam snorted at the reference to OPEC. "The cartel is run by the Saudis, who are under the mystical spell of the Bushes. That family has been involved with the House of Saud for generations. If the American president tells the king to jump, he only asks how high. But what is it you wanted to talk with us about, Minister Shevardnadze? I doubt you flew all the way from Moscow to talk with us about OPEC and the price of oil. We know what the Americans are up to, so tell us something we do not know," the president of Iraq said, very matter-of-fact. Direct and to the point. I like that in a world leader, Shevardnadze thought privately. "As a matter of fact, Mr. President, I have come to speak with you about an offer the Soviet Union would like to make to the people of Iraq." The Iraqi leaders leaned forward in their chairs a bit, their interest piqued at the possible proposition. "We are all ears, as the saying goes," Izzat al-Duri said, skeptical of what the Soviets would actually provide them. Shevardnadze explained, "The Soviet Union would like to provide the people of Iraq a substantial loan to lift your economy out of its economic slump and allow you to purchase the military equipment we are going to offer you. This loan will be in deferment until you are able to stabilize the Middle East under your guiding hand and tutelage. We are making this offer to you because we want Iraq to remove the American puppets from OPEC and restore the cartel's power. We also believe the Middle East would be better served if it were managed and controlled under the leadership of a strong central leader, as opposed to the smattering of feckless and spoiled monarchs as it is today." Izzat al-Duri and Saddam Hussein looked at each other before returning their gaze to the Russian. "That is a bold statement to make, even for the Soviet Empire. Your war in Afghanistan did not exactly go over well. What makes you think we want to become your next puppet?" Saddam replied. Before Shevardnadze could speak, he added, "What you are proposing, Foreign Minister, is a war that would entangle us with the Americans. Even with your aid, I do not believe our military would be able to stand up against the Americans when they intervene. And trust me, they will intervene to help the House of Saud." "You are correct, Mr. President. If your nation were to reclaim Kuwait as a province of Iraq, the Americans might intervene. If you move to capture Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, then the Americans would most likely move to intercede. However, if you move fast enough, and if the Persians can be persuaded to control the strait and keep the West out of the Gulf, then a negotiated peace, one that would be in your favor, could likely be achieved. More importantly, this move, if successful, would make you the de facto leader of the Arab world, the Russian said, hoping to appeal to the ego of the Iraqi leader. Tariq Aziz then entered the conversation. You are asking us to take an enormous risk. The likelihood of our surviving this war is not very good, especially once the Americans mobilize their forces and come to the aid of the Saudis. That is true. In its current state, your military would not last long. However, we are intent on giving you enough military equipment to win this war. When the Americans begin to mobilize their forces to challenge you, then our military will begin a large-scale military exercise of our own in Eastern Europe. This will cause the Americans to maintain their forces in Europe and not divert them to deal with you, the Russian countered. Saddam then asked, putting aside what the Americans may or may not do, what kind of military aid are you looking to provide us with? Handing them each a dossier, Shevardnadze replied, we are prepared to offer you a substantial aid package. I have a couple more packets containing the details of the military equipment we are willing to provide. Suffice it to say, we are prepared to transfer via military aid 200 of our modern T-80 main battle tanks with thermal and night vision optics. These tanks will give your armored forces an unrivaled advantage on the battlefield. President Gorbachev was made aware that most of your army is currently using the Chinese T-62 Mod 1972 tanks. We feel these are terrible tanks the Chinese have sold you. They are inadequate and will not stand up against modern-day tanks the Saudis have purchased from the British and Americans. To compensate for this, the Soviet people would like to replace them with 2,000 modern T-72s that will all be equipped with thermal and night vision optics for all-weather combat. This will allow you to change out all of your existing armor units with modern frontline tanks prior to this war. The four Iraqis practically fell out of their chairs at the foreign minister's offer of T-80 and T-72 main battle tanks. These were the Soviets' Tier 1 frontline tanks. Shevardnadze smiled as he saw their reactions. We are going to transfer 4,000 BTR-80s and 70s to replace your aging fleet of BTR-50s and 60s, he continued. This will greatly enhance your motorized division's capabilities to grab and seize territory across the desert. Along with the armored personnel carriers, we'll be transferring 2,000 BMP-3s and BMP-2s to assist your armor and mechanized forces. However, none of this will do you any good unless you are able to keep Kuwaiti and Saudi aircraft and helicopters off your backs. As such, 350 9K-35 Strela 10, ZSU 23F4, 9K-22 Tunguska, 9K-31 Strela 1, and 2K-12 Cub mobile anti-aircraft units will also be added to the aid package. This will be in addition to the 600 various self-propelled artillery units. Saddam shook his head in bewilderment at the paper he was holding and the information being given to him. He looked at the Russian foreign minister as if the man had horns growing out of his head. This must be some kind of joke. There is no way the mighty Soviet Union would give this kind of military hardware to Iraq. No one from the USSR, China, or the West has ever sold their top-of-the-line military equipment to us before. I assure you, Mr. President, this is no joke. President Gorbachev is essentially offering the government of Iraq the opportunity to purchase nearly an entire Russian army's worth of military equipment. We will provide you with all of the munitions to operate this equipment, along with up to 2 years of military trainers and advisor support to ensure your army understands how to use it. Izzat al-Duri cut in to add, I suppose there is a catch to all of this. Smiling, Shevardnadze replied, The only catch is that Iraq must use this equipment we are providing to take its rightful place as the leader of the Arab world and the head of OPEC. We ask that you work with us to restrict the flow of oil until we achieve a price point of $45. At this price, Iraq will be more than able to repay the Soviet Union's loan for this equipment, and our own economy will be saved from economic collapse caused by the West. Saddam then asked, "By when do we need to launch this attack?" "When our trainers and advisors arrive in Iraq, they will work with your people to teach them how to handle the equipment. When they can effectively use it without hurting themselves, then we will work with you on a timeline for when to launch your attack. Ideally, we would like this attack to begin next summer," the foreign minister offered. "I think we should discuss the Air Force and our integrated air defense while we are at it," replied Saddam. "The Americans recently sold the Saudis F-15E Strike Eagles, and the British sold them several squadrons of Tornadoes. We unfortunately learned during our war with Iran that our air defense network was not up to the standard it should be. What are you willing to offer us in this regard?" Saddam knew he was pressing his luck, but he hoped this would be his chance to improve his air force. The Soviet foreign minister sat back in his chair for a moment. He knew right then they had them. The Iraqis would do their bidding. They'd bring instability to the region, and they'd drive up the price of oil immensely, thus saving the motherland from economic ruin and collapse. The question now was, how much instability did they want to introduce? The ground equipment was one thing, but if they made their air force too strong, that might lead the Israelis to get involved, which would complicate things. They were a wild card in all of this. "Mr. President, this has been discussed as well. While we are going to upgrade your air force, we are going to limit the number of aircraft we'll be providing. This is largely because the training program for these aircraft is lengthy and will not fit within the current timeline. That said, the Soviet Air Force will provide Iraq with 48 MiG-29s, 34 MiG-23s, 48 Su-24s, 30 Su-25s, and 30 Special Reconnaissance and ECM aircraft. When the war has settled, we can discuss selling you additional frontline aircraft. This should be enough to help ensure you a swift victory against the Arab powers you are going to face." The group discussed the Russian offer for several more hours. They had an agreement in principle and agreed to meet again the following day to hammer out the finer details. Shevardnadze was under orders to get this agreement signed before he returned to Moscow, and he had every confidence that he would do just that. Chapter 4. Port of Qasr, July 1989. "This port is utterly worthless," Major General Sokolov commented to Colonel Chekhov as they watched the second set of freighters arrive from the Soviet Union. Chuckling, Chekhov replied, That it is, comrade. The real port is down in Kuwait. You know, Kuwait used to be a province of Iraq. It was administered out of Basra, then the British split it away from Iraq. The damn British have a way of intentionally splitting their former colonies up along ethnic, racial, and religious lines, knowing it'll cause hundreds of years of conflicts and fighting," commented the older general. "Why do you suppose the British do that?" Sokolov snorted at the younger man's question. "By splitting their colonies up like this, they ensured there will never be peace among them. That means instead of building a collective future together, they will be locked in perpetual conflict, thus never a threat to Great Britain." Colonel Chekhov shook his head in disgust. "All the more reason why I hate the West. We should have our war to end all wars and be done with them." Sokolov thought about telling the colonel about Joseph Stalin's use of the exact same tactic in Nagorno-Karabakh, where a large population of Armenians was handed over to the government of Azerbaijan. He brushed the thought aside. He had no idea how Chekhov would take the statement comparing Stalin to the imperialist British. Instead, he said, "All in due time, Colonel. Right now, Our focus is on making sure our new Iraqi allies are up to the task of using this wonderful equipment we are giving them." As the two of them stood there looking at the roll-on, roll-off ship, a handful of ground guides helped the driver maneuver the Ural 4320 fuel truck off the ship. When the driver had gotten it off the ship, it was driven over to a nearby train yard, where it would eventually be loaded onto some flat cars and eventually transported up to Baghdad or some other military base. The yard itself was packed with these heavy-duty 444 and 646 off-road refueling trucks. There were also hundreds of regular ordinary ash and trash, troop and cargo trucks used to transport large numbers of infantry soldiers and supplies for a large army formation. Parked next to the rows of trucks were several rows of BTRs. The old 1950s and 1960s versions of the armored personnel carriers with which the Iraqi army had been making do would be phased out in favor of these new vehicles. "I'll tell you this, General. If the Iraqi army is not able to win this coming war after all the equipment and training we'll be providing, then I'm not sure they're capable of winning a war," Colonel Chekhov said as they walked away from the port to head back to their waiting vehicle. Next, they'd proceed to the Iraqi military base north of the port. They had a series of meetings with their Iraqi counterparts to discuss the organization of the new training programs. In the coming weeks, thousands of Soviet trainers would be arriving to begin the process of showing the Iraqis how to use the newer versions of the equipment being delivered each day. It was already late July, and they didn't have a lot of time to get themselves ready for this summer campaign. 5 days later. Baghdad International Airport. The large nose of the Antonov An-124 Ruslan cargo plane was opened as a group of technicians swarmed around it. The operators began the process of unloading the equipment for the new S-200 surface-to-air missile system that would become part of the Baghdad Integrated Air Defense System. The sophisticated radar vehicles were offloaded, along with the rest of the equipment needed to operate the system. Every 3 days, 6 of the large An-124 Ruslan cargo planes would land at either Baghdad International Airport, the Iraqi Air Force Base in Balad, some 40 kilometers north of the capital, or the Talil Air Base near Nasiriyah. The large Russian aircraft were ferrying in the sensitive air defense equipment so it could be set up, and the training of the Iraqi soldiers who would operate it could start. The actual missiles themselves would continue to arrive via the ports. Looking out the window of their temporary office above the terminal, Colonel Chekhov remarked, "I cannot believe we are still moving forward with giving the Iraqis this missile system." Major General Sokolov just shrugged. "If they succeed in destroying more American aircraft with them, then it will have been worth it. You did see the report on their integrated air defense? They have so many holes in it. Just providing them with a few dozen newer radar sites alone is going to more than double their air defense capability." "I just worry about how much we're giving them, Comrade General. They are not ready for this level of sophisticated military equipment. It's like giving a young child a bicycle when they are not even ready to use a tricycle." "I understand your concern, comrade, but remember, the drop of water wears away the stone. We need patience with our Arab friends. That is why there will be hundreds of advisors who will continue to stay behind to help them operate the equipment so that when the time comes, they will be ready. The information we glean from the coming engagements will be put to good use with our own forces should the need ever arise. For the moment, Chekhov, let's be glad the hardliners are wanting to fight this war using them as their proxy. Things are becoming more unstable back home, as you can see. There was a period of time where I really thought the hardliners would initiate a war with NATO. Let us hope this coming conflict will satisfy their war lust," said the general. The two of them watched a little while longer as the cargo planes were unloaded. The number of Russian soldiers now in Iraq had grown to more than 2,000. By the end of October, that number would rise to upwards of 8,000 as the training program started in earnest. They were still unclear as to how many advisors would stay behind once the war started the following summer, but it was clear some would. The Iraqi army would need continued guidance on how best to employ the new weapons they were being given. August 1989. Balad Air Base, Yathib, Iraq. Major Vitaly Popkov landed one of the MiG-29s his country was apparently leasing to the Iraqi Air Force. Once on the ground, he taxied towards one of the hardened bunkers. A truck with some flashing lights on it was telling him to follow him to the correct bunker. Once his aircraft had stopped just short of it, the ground crew signaled him to shut down his engine. The crews came forward and brought a ladder for him so he could climb down. One of the ground crew had brought a small vehicle forward that would tow his aircraft the rest of the way into the hangar. When he stepped down onto the ground and pulled his helmet off, the air was stifling. The oppressive heat reminded him that he was thousands of kilometers from home. Looking at the ground crew, he felt a little relieved when he saw close to half of them appeared to be Soviet airmen. He'd done a few tours across the Middle East and Asia and seen his share of undertrained and undermotivated ground crews. The last thing you wanted was an unqualified crew servicing a state-of-the-art fighter like the MiG-29. A jeep pulled up to his aircraft, and a Russian lieutenant got out. "Excuse me, Major. I was told to drive you over to meet with Major General Sokolov and the other pilots." Popkov nodded at the junior officer. He grabbed his flight bag and hopped in the Russian-built UAZ utility vehicle. As they drove away from the flight line area, he saw several more MiGs taxiing toward hardened bunkers and a few more landing. He wasn't sure how many MiGs they were leasing to Iraq, but it was apparently more than 20. When the jeep stopped in front of what appeared to be an administrative building, the lieutenant told him to go ahead on in while he returned to the flight line to pick up more pilots. Upon entering the building, he was greeted by a sergeant who showed him to the briefing room. When Popkov walked in, he immediately spotted a lot of faces he knew. Men he'd flown with over the years from different squadrons. Some flew the 29s like him, others the MiG-23 fighter or the Su-24 and Su-25 strike planes. Clearly something was up. The question was what? "Look what the cat has brought us," said Major Konstantin Ayushiev as he walked over and shook his hand. Laughing at the sight of his old friend, Popkov said, "I see they let you out of Siberia, Kostya." "Well, when they offered me a chance to fly to this hellhole and escape another Siberian winter, who was I to say niet?" He unconsciously wiped the sweat off his neck, emphasizing the lack of ease with either of his assignments. Popkov laughed as the two took their seats. Kostya was a fantastic fighter pilot by any measure. Unfortunately, he'd made the mistake of sleeping with the wrong general's daughter after a party and had gotten caught. The old man had walked into his private study with some friends for a cigar, only to find Kostya with his pants around his ankles and the general's daughter's legs on his shoulders. Before he could even get his pants up, the general was screaming about transferring him to Kalinka Air Base in the middle of nowhere, Siberia. By the next morning, the orders were official, and Kostya was on a transport out of town. As they were settling in, the door opened and another handful of pilots filtered in. It went on like this for 20 or so minutes before the room filled up. Then Major General Sokolov walked in, and the room was called to attention. "Take your seats," bellowed the old general. Popkov guessed the old goat had probably been around since the Great Patriotic War. Judging by his rank, either he had committed a major sin like Kostya, or his drinking had become a problem known to everyone. "You all have been chosen to fly your aircraft to Iraq because you are being given a unique opportunity, an opportunity that only comes around once in a pilot's life, an opportunity that will require you to make a very difficult choice with virtually no information available in advance," the general explained as he surveyed the room. "Before we continue, I need to lay out some information, and you will be given a short moment to decide what you want to do. Here are the basic details. If you want to accept this new opportunity, then you will have to resign your commission from the Soviet Air Force effective immediately. Once you have done that, you will be briefed on this new opportunity along with what you will be paid. If you opt to resign, you will be offered the chance to return to the Air Force once this opportunity has ended. You will also be given an immediate promotion to your next pay grade. If you opt not to pursue this opportunity, it will not be noted negatively in your personnel file. But you will have to let us know immediately, and we will ask you to leave. Many of the officers looked at each other, wondering what kind of opportunity he was talking about. A sergeant passed out a folder for each of them to review. Inside was a simple resignation from the Russian Air Force and a standard non-disclosure agreement. Looking around, Popkov noticed that nobody seemed to be opting out. Not that he felt pressured to join. He did like the idea of advancing another grade in service. It was becoming harder to make the next rank. This promotion would fast-track him to general officer, something he aspired to be one day. Taking the pen, he signed his name and closed the folder. Once the sergeant had collected all the folders, the general walked back in. This time he was flanked by an Iraqi general and a junior officer who appeared to be his interpreter. For the next half hour, they were told they were now being hired by a local Iraqi company to work as advisors to the Iraqi Air Force and, if necessary, fly missions with the Iraqi Air Force. They were to be paid triple their Russian salaries, and if they had to fly in combat missions, they would be compensated for each one. If they scored an aerial victory, a separate bonus would be paid. The more Popkov heard, the more he realized they were being hired as a proxy or mercenary force for the Iraqi Air Force. Whatever it was they were up to, they were willing to pay top dollar for the Russian pilots' expertise. The Iraqi general explained they'd spend the next 7 or so months aggressively training their Iraqi counterparts to use their aircraft more effectively and in a combined arms fashion as the Iraqi army prepared to wage war again.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.